Hello and welcome. My name is Shannon Kemp and I'm the Chief Digital Officer for Dataversity. We would like to thank you for joining today's Dataversity webinar, Conceptual versus Logical versus Physical Data Modeling. It is the latest installment in a monthly series called Data Ed Online with Dr. Peter Aiken. Just a couple of points to get us started. Due to the large number of people that attend these sessions, you will be muted during the webinar. For questions, we'll be collecting them by the Q&A section. And if you'd like to chat with us or with each other, we certainly encourage you to do so. And just to note, the Zoom chat defaults to send to just the panelists, but you can absolutely switch that to network with everyone. To open the Q&A or the chat panel, you may find those icons in the bottom middle of your screen for those features. And to answer the most commonly asked questions, as always, we will send a follow-up email to all registrants within 2 business days containing links to the slides. And yes, we are recording and will likewise send a link of the recording to the session as well as any additional information requested throughout the webinar. Now, let me introduce to you our speaker for today, Dr. Peter Aiken. Peter is an acknowledged data management authority and associate professor at Virginia Commonwealth University, president of Data International, and associate director of the MIT International Society of Chief Data Officers. For more than 35 years, Peter has learned from working with hundreds of data management practices in 30 countries, including some of the world's most important. Among his 12 books are many firsts. Starting before Google, before data was big, and before data science, Peter has founded several organizations that help more than 200 organizations leverage data-specific savings, which have been measured at more than 1.5 billion US dollars. His latest project is Anything Awesome. And with that, let me turn everything over to Peter to get today's webinar started. Hello and welcome. Oh, you're muted, Peter. Sorry about that. Oh, you're still muted. There we go. Ah, perfect. Now we can hear you.
My apologies. What a great welcome, and I blew it entirely by having my new microphone cluster not ready and where to go. But it's welcome to everybody today. And yes, the topic is conceptual versus logical versus physical data modeling. And just briefly, what we're going to cover is an introduction to modeling data in general, because it is contextually relevant to what we're doing. We'll talk specifically about conceptual, logical, and physical modeling activities. They should all be seen, though, moreover, as a transition from one to another. And the main way of understanding that transition is this thing I call the washing machine diagram that's located to the right. Here you can see as is and to be on it. We'll go through that in more depth as we get started around this. In fact, let's go ahead and just jump right in and start talking about this, which is really an interesting topic. And I had 3 of my dear colleagues reach out to me. David Hay, who has a wonderful book on the topic here, and a YouTube that he'd love you to get to listen to as well. Dr. Bernard Talheim, who's done some of the really fine academic work on this. And these are just a couple of papers that he's done that you might find relevant out there. And our dear friend, Gordon Everest, and he has a take on this. All 3 of these gentlemen reached out to me in advance of talking about this topic and wanted to make sure they got their perspectives in. It was absolutely delightful talking to everybody. What we're all collectively concerned about is that there's just an immense amount of data being created. And I could read these individually back to you, but just understand that it's increasing at an increasing rate. And it is useful to sort of get an idea that most of the data that we're working with was only created in the last 2 years. And that represents an amazing context for us, because data is growing like this and our analysis capabilities are simply not even close to keeping up on this. We do have some measurements that they love to throw up, but it's still pretty bad news all the way around on this, that if we want to do better, and this is, of course, assuming that the data is in really good shape. Unfortunately, most data is sort of a dumpster fire. I won't say all, but certainly much more than we'd like it to be. And that not understanding what bad data looks like means we have lack of respect for understanding, in this case, architectures, which all organizations have, and could be a variety of different types. About 1 in 10 organizations actually tries to maintain 1 or more of these architectures. Some of these are understood, which is good. Again, you have to have the architecture if you exist, but if you don't understand it, if it's not documented, how can anybody understand it? It's going to be very problematic for you. And more importantly, the understanding has to be met by a shared group that is comprised of business users, also with the technical users, also with the systems users on this, in order to make sure that we have full understanding all the way around of how all this works. Because absent that, we create sand in the machinery at the absolute lowest level of the organization. And what we're talking about is very simple things, such as a common vocabulary. And the vocabulary in this case are going to be the nouns that are going to be attached to the models as we get to them in context here. But the challenge is that most data is encumbered by some form of data debt. And you really have to undo some existing things to sort of get to a zero spot before you can try to go deeper into it. But these data challenges are vastly underestimated in most instances. Let's give a precise definition to data at this point in time. We may throw out the number 42, and if you happen to be a fan of Douglas Adams, you would know that the number 42 represents the meaning of life. And the rest of you who have no idea what I'm talking about, hold on tight. Number 42 also was the number on Jackie Robinson's jersey. And in fact, the title of the film about his life. So there's another meaning for the number fact 42 that's there. We'll go ahead and put a third one up because it's always good to do it in threes. And that's just the question of, is Peter allowed to buy alcoholic beverages in the Commonwealth of Virginia? Well, 42 was my age 24 years ago. So you can do the math and see that, in fact, I am eligible to drink alcoholic beverages. But of course, nobody should drink and drive around that. Well, that little deviation there mainly took your mind to starting to think about 42 as a fact, but could be paired with different things to mean different activities and situations that are here. And only when the data is paired with a fact and a meaning does it become, in fact, meaningful. That is the definition of it. And we also have to find a subset of data that is more useful to us than everything, because everything, as we've already seen, is impossible to keep up on. Data becomes information when it's requested, and that form of requesting the data is the main thing that differentiates it, because it's still going to come back and say 42 is the number of Jackie Robinson's jersey, if that's the question that you ask. But now it has been transformed into information because somebody has asked for it. This gives a wonderful, you can have data without information, but you can't have information without the data. Again, it's why they should be managed together as opposed to separately, and all sorts of other components that go on around that. We've just got one more stop on this particular build journey here. That's the idea of what is intelligence. And intelligence, oftentimes it's been called knowledge or wisdom systems, but it's how is that information used in the organization. And those are the three ways we can objectively define this architecture here, such that we're all on the same page. And these definitions, we've been using them. I ran across them in the Department of Defense back in the 1980s around this. That thing that just bounced there was a data structure. That's an arrangement of data showing that, again, useful data is a combination of a fact and a meaning, and useful data, when it's provided in response to a request for that, it becomes information. And when it's used strategically, it then becomes intelligence. Excuse me. So keep that in mind as a data structure, because there's a generalized data structure: customer, sales order line, product, a way of pinning down customers and tying them to products that have been purchased. And we can look at a good computer sciencey definition that says, lots of really important things. But what we're really talking about here are the rules for the grammar. What can customers do? Are they unique? Is there a balance? Are they arranged in a certain way? The more important question on all of these, how many do we want, just as structures? And the answer is, gosh, as few as possible. So if we ever have an option of creating something new, or generally keeping what we have and perhaps modifying it slightly as opposed to creating a new version, that should be our answer in today's data world. It's just kind of crazy to operate otherwise. In fact, the numbers are so intense for some organizations, it becomes really problematic. If you look at this hypothetical situation of just 6 applications connecting each other, if everything was truly going to be connected to everything else, it would be 15 interfaces, and the number of applications 6 times 6 minus 1, 5 divided by 2 gives us 15 on the top there. Well, that experience takes us a ways on this. For example, with this number was given to me to use by the Royal Canadian Bank a number of years ago, where they said they had 200 major applications and about 5,000 interfaces between all of these. Let's just see how that works on a comparison basis. If we look, you can see 6 going to 60, going to 600. We'll put their piece out there at 200 right there, and 5,000. They're clearly better than average, and they still have a very large and complex situation on their hands. So again, the fewer of these things that we have in an organization, that's got to be a stated objective goal in order to work towards this. Each of these models can be put on a framework. The first one I'm going to show you is as is, represented by the little 4 icon toolkit that's there in the left-hand side. So we have 3 versions of as is. I'll come back and tell you about them in a minute. The other is to be. That's what we'd like to have. So we have existing in the brown, and we'd like to have in the blue sky version of that below, but it's a 3-dimensional model. So we also need a dimension going back, and that is whether the model has been validated or not validated. And that's going to be true whether it's an as is or a to be model. So you can now see we've got a space that's relatively defined. We just have one more row to put on it. The labels for that are conceptual, logical, or physical models. So each of these models at the conceptual, logical, or physical level can be either as is or to be. And if it hasn't been validated, it is unvalidated. So we're going to keep that in mind. Again, it's just sort of a way to think about it. When we're doing as is, and the way we've taught people in school to do this is that they build the requirements, which are in some form of a loose leaf binder of some sort. We then create them into a model to come up with our logical model on this, and then get the actual physical implementation of the system as it's put together. Every modeling change that we make can be mapped to some transformation on this framework here. And really that's the best way to think about them, is what are we trying to get to? What are the focuses, the goals of the specific modeling that we're doing? And again, as I was saying before, most people start off with sort of a forward engineering. These are assuming validated models, and they're simply building these. Now, there's a challenge associated with that, and that is that when you get to the real world, we spend 80% of our dollars in the real world making existing things better and fixing things that have gone wrong with our existing things. And there's only 20% of our dollars go into building new stuff around that way. And while we teach people how to do only that as part of school is just sort of crazy, but we really need to pay attention to is the aspect of reverse engineering, taking the existing systems, understanding them. And as my friend Elliot Tchaikovsky wrote a while back, Elliot evolved existing systems using a structured technique aimed at recovering rigorous knowledge of the existing system to leverage enhancement efforts. And that's, of course, the key to it. We want to go from physical as is to logical as is, and logical as is to conceptual as is. In there, if we need to change the requirements, if we don't, we can stop at the logical how. In fact, the reengineering process, where most organizations are attempting to do right now, but are doing relatively poorly, is to reverse engineer the existing systems. After all, if you don't understand the existing systems' strengths and weaknesses, how are you going to avoid replicating the bad stuff? And how do you go about making sure that you recreate the good stuff? Again, as I mentioned before, if you go to the requirements level and change actually the requirements, you have to reverse engineer it twice in order to come up with that. The next part is to go from your existing as is requirements to be requirements. Now you have been informed by this. You use this information. There's also another opportunity, as I mentioned before, which is just to go design to design. If you're not changing the requirements, it's perfectly acceptable to go straight there. Then make sure, of course, everything syncs together and put it in place so that you can get things rolling on that. This is the proper way to do it. And yet what happens in most instances is that organizations forklift the data directly from the physical as is to the physical to be without a single thought about what goes on in the meanwhile. And that is, of course, crucially harmful to most of our organizations. This model I just turned on its side here, if you will, maps, relatively speaking, to the ANSI Spark stuff. And I've got the reference to the Wikipedia article right there, but you can see they both deal with a conceptual level and a physical level. And the part they differ on is a logical level in between, which we found in the data modeling community to be quite useful, again, depending on exactly what you're attempting to come up with in order to look at this. The conceptual model, again, is focused on abstract requirements. Logical is considered to be a refinement, but not necessarily an abstraction in many instances. And that's one of the things one of our contributors pointed out in their presentation. And then the physical implementation, how does it work in Oracle or in AWS Cloud or whatever else it is you're doing? But you should be able to change that back end in a way that doesn't impact the users. Of course, we all been through those pieces where we have been impacted in a real negative way around that. These are all mappable to John Zachman's framework in this quadrant right here. If you look at the inventory and process representations, the what and how columns close up, again, they map very nicely onto conceptual, logical, and physical implementations of those models. Another way to think about the utility of each of these is the way they build bridges, interestingly enough. And this is, I haven't been here to this one, but this is a favorite of mine in terms of what they've done here. The old bridge, the old way of going was that yellow line that I'm drawing for you right there. It took a lot longer and was problematic enough that they were willing to strip this area entirely and make it a wonderful marvel of this. It was focused on improving commerce around there. The conceptual model in this case was at the entity level. It provided focus and scope to the modeling effort. It was rarely maintained that once you get the original one out, you just want to make sure it looks close enough to the product. The logical then was really the plan to take the what in the conceptual and go to the how, the transition from logical, from conceptual to physical in there. And this was the plan that's needed in almost all data modeling instances in order to do this. Generally, these are developed to the attribute level and understood as a third normal form model. Doesn't mean they're maintained that way in order to do that. And they really need to be refined until it becomes close enough to a solution that you can purchase, maybe tailoring it as opposed to customizing it in today's environment. And really having a good understanding that the business characteristics that you're modeling are going to complement those that your business is trying to achieve in the process of doing this. Finally, these are maintained by more organizations. The physical models, again, how are we actually going to build this, are the blueprints for actually building any of these out. And they are absolutely used on an ongoing basis in order to do this. Now, I want to spend a second on this quick animation here. I'll voice over it here real briefly just to let you see that they were putting this piece together where they were taking the bridge and actually just moving it out. You can see this is just together like this. And when they got the bridge together, then it became structurally intact. Only then, after they put the two pieces and actually connected them, was the building, the bridge in this case, stronger as a result of that connection than it would have been weaker otherwise. And you may say to yourself, wow, that was pretty incredible. How did they do that? Well, they had one problem. They couldn't push sideways on any of the piers that were up there. This has become a very common way of building buildings. And they use this wonderful device here. They gave, oops, sorry, I'm going to go back and do that again. You can get the sense for what happened as these things came together and that they were stronger after getting together, very much like your databases will be stronger because it will have structural integrity as opposed to not around that. Again, topic way beyond the where we're focusing on today on this. The second part of this is really brilliant. How do you move these bridges so that they put only downward pressure on them? And the answer was you drag them up a slight incline that was about 2 feet of lift that they got to the entire bridge. And they pulled it forward and then pulled the wedge out from underneath it and set it down directly on top without applying any side pressure to it whatsoever. Just a really interesting way of doing this, and it has produced some really outstanding engineering feats. This is just one of them. In order to do that, they needed all three of these kinds of models to sell this bridge to the public in France so that they would pay for it in order to do this. Well, let's get back to data on this. And within that same context of where we were selling the bridge conceptually, you might ask the question, how are components expressed as architectures? And the answer is that details are organized into larger chunks. And that's a pretty intricate process on that. Then the larger components are organized into models. And the models in this case become our data models, but they also introduce physical dependencies in our data. You have to have a record of a customer before you can do any charges to the customer record. And then overall, those models are introduced into architectures, which now really focus strategically on purposefulness. So we're going to keep all three of those: intricacy here, where they're put together in a way, and here's a little thing that we've done up here: thing, club ID, club description, club status, sex to be assigned, reason, reservation, etc. Then they're organized into models. So we now take these collections of entities and organize them, and again, into purposefulness. Now, one of the questions people ask all the time is, why are there no really good examples of data models? There are actually. If you go out and look at the DoD data model that we did more than 30 years ago, I believe at this point, it's still in use around DoD in various forms or another, but it's much complexity and it takes a long while to become used to them on this. More importantly is to think about that stuff that I was showing you being a collection of stuff in a data dictionary, a glossary, a vocabulary level, whatever you're going to call it in this case. And that these data models and the architecture as a result is developed in response to specific needs. So the organization understands a specific set of needs that they have to address from a data model perspective. This gets them at some specific information system requirements. Again, capture all that we can in the trusted catalog, whatever we're going to call it in there. And now you can see we go around and iterate on these, each one producing a slightly refined, evolving version of the product. In this case, the product is the data model at the center as we're learning how to use these. This is in order to avoid what we see too much in the industry, which is the situation of the princess on the P, as it's properly called, from Hans Christian Andersen Ulysses. I circled the P at the bottom there, that green thing, and there's the princess at the top who's sleepless as a result of having this imperfection in it. Now, it's not just as trivial in this case as the princess with ADHD, but perhaps more along the lines of a serious defect in a product can haunt it through the entirety of its product. And there's several companies that have had these kinds of oopsies as they've gone out. Because if you start out with a flawed data model, it locks in these imperfections for the life of the product. It restricts data investment benefits in the future, and it decreases the organization's ability to leverage, consuming in the process of migrating, converting, and improving 20 to 40% of all IT budgets. Lack of all these things takes longer, costs more, delivers less, and presents greater value in this case. Let's get a couple of quick examples. Here's an example of a database for what used to be called iTunes, is now called the music in the Apple ecosystem over there. And if you look, I've purchased 3 rows of data in this case. Each data is associated with a song, and there's the price on those pieces of data. So yay, I made a database. Great. Here's an interesting question, though, we like to ask. What information would be lost if we deleted record number 1? And in this case, if we deleted record number 1, we lose the fact that Peter purchased We Met Today, as well as the fact that We Met Today cost 99 cents. That's 2 facts in one row of data. That's usually unintended and undesirable around that. And these are some simple tests that you can go through yourself and take a look at various data designs as you're presented to them. Here's an insertion anomaly. Suppose I want to insert a new song named Scuba and it costs $1.29. I can't enter it into this database until I have an actual purchaser for it. So we can't insert a full row until we have an additional fact about that row. Again, undesirable, unintended. Update anomalies. Suppose I want to change the price of We Met Today from 99 cents to $1.29. The process of going through and examining everything in song and changing all of them as well as a complex process. And of course, if there's any spelling errors in there, I'm going to miss them. They're not going to work either. Point of all this being that there are correct ways to have data organized, and it can be done on the basis of flexibility, adaptability, retrievability, all sorts of things. And the bottom line, when you get to all of it, and this is not a course in it, is that you're going to try to have as little as possible one fact stored with one row of data. So while that may be our original, our better set of doing it is to maintain a master set of tracks, records, songs, and that when I change the price for those songs, the price of that song is repopulated out to the entire database. And there's a one-to-many relationship between each of the songs in the pricing database and each of the purchases that a purchaser has on top of that. The problem is your IT workers don't know this, your knowledge workers don't know this, and it just becomes sand getting in the gears in order to do this. Let's jump into the conceptual modeling here. Again, this is the pink chartreuse, if you will, level that's up there. It still has validated and unvalidated and as is and to be as well in order to take a look at it. The goal of a conceptualized data modeling effort is to harmonize standard vocabulary. Again, I mentioned the three-way that we had to put together before in order to get it to work, focusing on strategic issues that are there and not on details, really on how is this new system going to help us achieve organizational strategy in a more satisfying way. We shouldn't have an unvalidated data model that just doesn't make sense. Would you want the word draft on your strategy for the organization? I think most organizations would pass on that option. So helps organize the data concepts, give us some ideas as to what the relationship of data things ought to be around there, documenting these in such a way and trying to figure out our first version of these system-wide definitions as we go through the entire process. Also, we're likely to get somewhat of an idea of what a high-level process interaction would look like given that type of an interaction with the organization. All discussions of architecture are going to involve at least faster, better, cheaper. And my good friend Michael Adams used to have this on the back of his business card. He said, we offer 3 kinds of services. You get to pick any 2 of them. Yes, what a wonderful thing. Again, good reason for not trying to do too much around this, but it's a tried and true method in terms of that. And if everybody says they can get you all 3 at once, they can probably sell you the Brooklyn Bridge as well. So let's look at why we need to focus this. And the real key, of course, is strategy. We didn't use the word a whole lot until about 1950 when the business people discovered it and discovered you could sell people 100 PowerPoint slides or a 100-page report for lots of money. This really made strategy into a thing. Again, where is the strategy? I want to look it up. Well, that's not how it's used. How it was originally used in the military. The definition is a pattern in a stream of decisions. And this is much more of a process than it is a thing in order to do this. Walmart's, through quick examples, Walmart's former strategy was everyday low price. You knew this, Walmart knew you knew this. The entire flight crew going to Walmart's Bentonville Airport understands this. It's cemented into everybody's head. Everyday low price is exactly what Walmart was about for many, many years. And it was a very successful implementation of their strategy. Example number 2, Wayne Gretzky in soccer. Wayne Gretzky's definition of strategy is he skates to where he thinks the puck will be. After all, if you're playing a game where you're chasing around a solid little rubber ball there and it travels much faster than human beings do, you want to be where the puck is going to be as opposed to chasing the puck, or you will never succeed in this particular game. Lots more of it at the Wikipedia entry on Wayne Gretzky's entry at Wikipedia's site up there. One last example here, Napoleon facing a larger army. Napoleon is in blue, the British facing him, and the Prussian in red for the British, black for the Prussians are facing him, and Napoleon doesn't know exactly how to get out of it. The answer is, of course, divide and conquer. You're looking for a pattern in a stream of decisions around that. Well, let's review that last one real quick. First of all, the key is to hit both armies in exactly the right spot so that they'll break apart. Then we're going to have everybody turn to the right and defeat the Prussians, and then turn to the left and defeat the British. And oh, by the way, can you do this, please, while somebody is shooting at you? It's not an easy task. Argue that it's a complex strategy. And of course, if you know anything about history, you know that it in fact did not work for Napoleon around this. So strategy has to be simple. Here's even a simple strategy that didn't work for an organization that I used to work for many, many moons ago that was trying to gain additional efficiencies around this. But by making a manager and a salesperson different types of people, they weren't able to capture data about them, and they were unable to gain efficiencies during a time when many other organizations were able to gain from those efficiencies. Other uses of strategic data models include the Sabre creation of the flight booking process, AT&T inventing a new credit card business literally overnight, Amazon selling satisfaction or overnight delivery, Capital One reinventing solicitation around all these. Each of these are very much database centric copies, and the actual data that they used at the center of this was considered to be organizational property at the highest level of security, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So let's, again, change topics slightly and just talk about the process of data modeling. And what you probably want to start with is the idea of identifying entities, big blocks of person, places, or things about which you're going to create, read, update, or delete information about. Then you want to identify a key for each of the entities. How am I going to identify a unique instance of that? How am I going to find out this Peter Aiken versus the one that's a lawyer in Florida versus the one that is a rock concert promoter in Ireland? And after we've identified the key, we draw a rough map of it back and forth to connect the various relationships that are there. Then we identify the data attributes and parcel them out among the various entities that we're taking a look at. It's perfectly okay. In fact, it'd be surprising if your model didn't evolve slightly at first. If it's still modeling or evolving or radically changing, you're not focusing in on a solution. And that's, of course, one of the measures of this that you want to take a look at in order to do so. You should discover new things in your data model incrementally, and they should fall off into diminishing returns platform. Here's a very specific model that we did. This is a logical model comprising 5 model views from the taxpayer, client, governance, program delivery, and vendor view for our State Department of Social Services. It was a number of years ago, but still reasonably cogent on this. So you can see here that the taxpayer view had information on payments, taxpayers, benefits, social service programs, and that the client view had information on payments. Whoops, sorry, I'm going to go back. Payments, clients, client benefits, and welfare agencies. In other words, each of these was focused in on that point that was of most interest to them. Governance, gosh, surprising, was most complicated in that context around this. Then a program delivery view, these are what our partners are going to see. So each of these represent perspectives on the organization, and the logical model is a great way to show how they all fit together in that type of a context. Looking at this, finally, the vendor view, which is where do I get paid, and all that, and it, of course, sums up to a very nice view of it. I mentioned before, this glossary. It's the start of your enterprise taxonomy. It defines the initial entities for the conceptual data model. It engages the business community on providing terms. And I want to tell a very specific story about a use of a business glossary that I'm quite proud to have observed and learned from over the years. It has to do with Nokia. Pre-Microsoft acquisition, they were a tremendously gifted company. They had gone from tires and rubbers to consumer electronics, phones on this. And when I approached them at the phone stage, Finns are bilingual because 2% of their population speaks Swedish, and they don't want to be impolite to that 2%. Nokia also wanted to play internationally on the stock exchange and elsewhere, and mandated the use of business in all business settings. So fortunately for me, who didn't speak Finnish or Swedish, when I went to the meetings, they spoke them in English. Lots of these words were unknown, and outside of data modeling entirely, they first of all made it culturally bad not to ask questions. So when the word came up that they didn't know, they would look at each other, and if there were 2 people that said, yes, we don't know what this means, they would build a common vocabulary. They would literally reach for their notebooks in there to see if there was a golden version of the term in the Nokia term bank. If not, a quick vote by the work group would decide whether to include it in the Nokia term bank. It would not be automatically included. It went to a filtering group that weekly reviewed the submissions and put out a new version. The new versions were, by the way, published as a single web page, and the only access mechanism was getting access to the web page and then using the search function of the web page to search. This is about as inexpensive as you can come up with on all of this. Again, Nokia term bank. Wonderful experience. Unfortunately, we were curious. We were taking pictures of this thing that was in many of the offices. We asked questions about it. And they said, oh, that's our cruiser collector. And we said, what is that? And they handed us a 50-page document that described much more in detail than they had about any of the data models that, of course, we were there to discuss around with them. Remember, this is the environment that we're working in. First, we're reverse engineering something of an existing system, and then we're going to understand that information as part of the existing, the to-be design. And only when we use that design are we going to be using it next in order to do that. Let's look at our next chunk then, the logical models that are here. Again, this is the middle, the orange row. They can be validated or not validated. They can be as is or to be. Remember, every single one of your mappings goes into one of those. So if you don't understand where you are and where you're trying to get to, you probably don't have a good enough focused session around this. Again, from a logical perspective, you now start to talk about size and shape. Where's the data going to come from? What are the functions, the downstream uses? Gives us the ability to do this free from technology considerations. Of course, we know it's going to go in the cloud until the cloud continues to get hacked, and then it'll all come back on-prem, but that's just the way it goes. Going to start to document some original and preliminary data designs that show how we're satisfying specific business objectives. So the as is, they're going to challenge the conceptual model. You may come up with a difference, which is great. It shows refined thinking in most cases. Explicitly incorporate relevant components, starting to incorporate your as is stuff. The two B's are going to be the principle around when new systems are built, using that common vocabulary in order to do this. Now, most of the time, people will tell you when you're doing your modeling to use a definition. So here's a definition of a bed, something that you would sleep in. I was taught by Clive to do it much more focused, which is to come up with a purpose statement. Here we have one called bed. It's a data asset type that's a principal data asset type. So there's a hospital bed up in the right-hand corner to give you a conceptual thing of what's going on there. It describes why is the information maintaining. In other words, why are we maintaining information about beds? Now, interestingly, it was that second clause there. It contains information about beds within rooms that proved to be interesting on us. So we've had a source, interestingly. We have some attributes that we're using to describe it on there. And we have some associations, and this is where it got to be very interesting. One room can contain 0 or many beds. How are you going to tell? Well, this time we were going to put a tracking device on each of the beds, and the beds were going to tell us where the patients were being lost. Luckily, it was only in a draft form because we were able to show them that they had neglected to understand what is the nature of the room, of a hallway or an elevator, both of which broke their model. And how is it going to be the case that we're going to maintain this information tracking once we get outside of the hospital itself, so for outpatient services and things like this. Again, just minor things, but we were able to go through and focus in there. So fix that piece, validate the model, move on. Here's another question that you want to ask at your logical level. You've got beds and rooms. Great. There's a relationship between them. What should it be? A bed's related to a room. Nice attempt, but not good enough. Let's go a little bit deeper. Here we go. Many beds are related to many rooms. Well, that's a tough information solution problem. If you look at it carefully, you'll figure out why. And here's the final solution in this case for this particular instance, which is that one room can contain 0, 1 or more beds in each room. That third requirement now gives you the most precise focus on it. You will get very different systems out of very different people depending on which of those 3 requirements are instance. What if beds can be moved about the rooms, right? And now we have other things that pop into place. These are the 5 cardinality options that are postulated across these. Again, you can have exactly one or many, eventually one. Again, it's a nuance of data modeling, probably for a more advanced topic, but you're saying you're adding the element of time to it, saying that you'd like to have in there. Same thing, 0, 1 or many optionals coming out along those. Each of these is going to give you a different way to look at it. Let's look at it in a specific example here. Again, this is our room and patient and bed situation. And recall, in this case, we've got a one-to-many relationship between room and bed, and a one-to-many, many relationship between patients and beds. So a bed is placed in one and only one room, and a room contains 0 or more beds. In this case, a bed is occupied by 0 or more patients, and a patient occupies 1 or more beds. Don't ask too many questions on that. It gets sticky really quickly. This gives us the ability to come up with these conceptual data models that may be like some of the information on this page here, where you're simply looking at what is the relationship between an employee and a sales rep and all the rest of these. And you can see there's some one-to-many and one-to-one and other types of things. There's lots of notions. Most people use what's called information engineering. And really, it's a matter of picking it to do. Here's another example of a work product that comes out of one of these exercises. One of the groups may come up with a representation describing the relationship formally between account, subscriber, charge, and bill in this case. And you can see it's formally tapped out. And the knowledge workers of the organization say, This is the way we will speak about these things in the future, giving us, again, the ability to focus in on this type of an activity, making it just really, really easy to get on the same page and eliminating in the process often hundreds and hundreds of tiny, tiny cuts that are sort of stabbing into organizations because they do a bad job at this. So again, just remember, we're reverse engineering. We're using that information in the design of the new system, and we're creating it. And our data model is one way of transferring some information between these various stages as you're trying to move things around the organization. Lastly, again, our topic here, we move to physical. So again, this is the bottom end, if you will, of the scale here. Again, we have certainly as is and to be, and we have validated and non-validated, and those terms become much more important in this type of modeling because you're looking at evidence-based type of information. These activities are more related to archaeology than they are necessarily between creativity. Some very interesting books, we can talk about that at the end there, give us some ideas. But the idea is to look at and to be able to recreate what are the actual data structures that are used in the various data flow diagrams and entity relationship diagrams throughout the organization to continue to populate the dictionary, glossary, catalog, whatever we're going to call it, together so that we have these. And there should be a one-to-one component verification between the components in the physical as-is system and the physical as-is model. Another question is, why would anybody be hand-making DDL with today's tool capabilities? They are so powerful that it's a matter of regenerating rather than trying to correct DDL. They had to have that in order to put the system into production as well. Remember, that business is going from the what to the how. Very critical on there because these do become the blueprints for the solution that need to be maintained in order to keep these things. There's some interesting aspects from physical perspective. Again, these should be the foundational system. One of the tricks that people use when they're testing this is they'll walk into an organization and have a stopwatch and see how long it takes to produce the actual results that are requested there. Sometimes it's very close to seconds, and sometimes it's very close to months in order to do that. How do we go about accessing the data that's actually in the system? We can oftentimes apply semi-automated reverse engineering techniques to this. And again, my first book was on that very subject for the U.S. military in order to do that. Again, taking a look at the specifications for accessing the data of the application, what are the current and future data elements that are maintained by this? And again, these things can be maintained semi-automatically in a way. So the data is going to be persons, places, or things that need to be created, read, updated, or deleted. Some people add the word archived onto that in order to come up with a CRUD-A model or a CRUD model. These are attributes, they are characteristics of the various things that we have in each area. Here's an example. We're looking at attributes and relationships. We can talk about clubs and regions. So here's a region entity with a club ID as a primary key. Here's another one with a club reporting with a club ID, and you can see that's the common key between the two. Again, notice the crow's feet. One region has many clubs reporting to it, but a club does not report to multiple regions. Other attributes of interest include name and weather. And what does this tell us right away? Well, it says clubs need to be identified separately from one another. Not sure particularly why, but it's clearly a business requirement. And that club-specific information is likely maintained as part of this description around here. That some level of organization exists above the club level, which is, again, this region concept. You can see by filling out some additional parts of this, each club must be part of a region as a business rule that is implemented by this particular data model. If you don't get this right, it's very difficult to change in production and almost impossible to change in software. We look around the uses. An organization may decide to characterize parts of things in a way I've got set up there on the right, and that whether it has these tables that are allowed. So all clubs can have a status. Many reasons can be assigned to a reservation. ID permits every club to be distinct from every other club, and description is likely to be unique for every particular club. So this gives us the idea that we can use this. The model variances are really focusing in on trying to make sure we have as many things in common as we can. Because if we have too many of those data structures, we're going to spend all our time transforming between data structures. You think I'm kidding? I've seen it. That's out there. Again, what are the data things for? What do they do? How do they interact? We need to understand this because data, remember, is going to become the most valuable thing of our assets going forward. It maps critical business needs. It contains essential data to the data consumers, functioning as a kind of sheet music. Again, good set of musicians that are all able to read music are going to ask for the sheet music before they start to sing, just knowing that things go better if you're singing off the same sheet of music, and that the metadata is essential to other business functions. The process is iterative and may include logical, physical, and conceptual models as you're trying to figure out. But once the modeling is done, make sure that you're trying to achieve a specific goal and not just doing it for modeling's sake. Now, these are the 5 basic structures that you'll find at the heart of most production data. A flat file, a index sequential file, a network database, a hierarchical database, and a relational database. And then there's everything else. And the everything else is, it really doesn't have much to tell you about. It's usually a predefined or everything's index kind of thing. Nothing wrong with any of them, but you're still going to come down to one of these. It's important to be somewhat familiar with them because these outperform the other types of databases in terms of production functions. Almost what happens almost always is that you make your breakthrough in the things that are listed in purple there, and then you transform it into something that will be productionable so that you don't end up running into a cliff given that situation. Here's an easy one to understand just from an architecture perspective. Again, you guys know that I'm a university professor at VCU, and we had something originally here called a student database master, and that's file, the parent-child relationship between that and each of the other components, even though you can't read them, and please don't try, I'm not trying to break your eyes, but showing that one parent is related to many children in there, and that this was the way in which this data was organized and ran for the university context for many, many years. Perfectly fine set of tasks in order to do this. We were propositioned at one point with a alternative, and we simply send us a model, and they sent us this. And we just had to laugh because there's absolutely no correspondence between these two models in terms of showing what one will do. The more important part was that while we certainly knew this was the physical as is model that we did, took that out of a class of students actually that did that. This was, they couldn't even tell us, was it a data model, a conceptual model, a logical model, a physical model? Again, we couldn't read anything on there, as you can't either, and it was just a very unsatisfactory time. But if they can't explain this to you and answer the simple question like, is this a logical, physical, or conceptual model, and does it represent as is and to be, and has it been validated? That's gonna be a problem here. The differences between model levels are not necessarily one is a decomposition of the other, just the same way as on Zachman framework, it doesn't work that way, but that there are differences. Here's a conceptual model for HR. Again, we're not going to go through this. I'm leaving this as reference material for you to come back and look at, because of course, we're recording this, but it gives you some information conceptually about what HR is going to take care of, and a logical model, which turns out to be actually simpler than that in there, and a physical model overview. And we're going to look at the details. There's the physical piece, part 1 of 4, part 2 of 4, part 3 of 4, and part 4 of 4. And you may say to yourself, why am I looking at these? Well, the idea is that these have very different differences. It's a terrible thing to say, for very specific reasons. Again, different models are communicating different pieces to different audience. Your physical as is going to be closer to your technical people, but needs to have the same common vocabulary so that when you discuss logical or conceptual models with your business people, you're able to, in fact, actually participate in a meaningful conversation around this. And again, remembering in all cases, we're reverse engineering first and then understanding our existing. The only time you don't go through this process is when you're starting a brand new system for a brand new company. And that does happen occasionally, but not on a fairly regular basis. So we're going to do some quick overviews here, and I've got a bit of wind-up material in order to start again. Where we started was back at the top of the hour with an introduction to data modeling, looking at 3 types of data modeling, plus a couple of characteristics that we looked in them. But to say that a data model is done so that you start to solve a specific business problem or answer a specific question in order to do that. I'll give you an example of that coming right up. Conceptual models then are motivated by understanding architectural trade-offs, incorporating strategy in the data modeling, and starting the concept of putting together your common vocabulary. Logical, again, trying to get to simplicity. So as you take your original conceptual model, it might be messier than you thought, and somebody else who's trained at design work, which is a skill in and of itself that we don't teach anymore, will permit you to simplify the original design, motivate things towards standards, and make sure that the business meets strategy in that. And then we get to the physical component, which is to say that we need to understand what's actually happening in our systems. We're documented either before or after very quickly in order to do this. Ideally, it's printed out so that you can use it to build and generate, in this case, physical construction of the solutions, and used as maintained as physical solutions on that. So we're headed towards the Q&A part, but I got a couple more things to sort of sum up with. There are correct ways to organize data. All involve modeling data. So if data modeling is not being done, it is incorrect, just by definition. On there, flexibility, adaptability, retrievability, risk reduction, these are all ways of optimizing your design, which is a good reason to take do the transfers that we're speaking of in order to do this. And I gave an example with the music database. Techniques include data integrity. Remember when that bridge joined and made it stronger? Data integrity is very much like that. Remembering things like smart codes are bad and dumb codes are good. We could talk about that in the Q&A part if you wanted a little bit, but just imagine those of you that are older, and I have to tell you, I was just back from China, where they have a saying in China that Dama is either gray hair or no hair on that. And I fall into both those categories in some respects, but they certainly understood the concepts around figuring out some of these old ways of doing things. Architectures, again, things are just ways that work in order to do this, but don't really amount to much in terms of what we're trying to come up with. If we want world peace, we're never going to get anywhere. So start out by not telling them that you're modeling. Don't invite them to a modeling session. They're subject matter experts, and what you need to do is you need to understand their expertise. They actually do understand the information that you need to have, but you need to communicate them. But don't say we're going to bring you to a modeling session, because then they feel pressure. Just start writing some stuff down. I know that sounds absolutely nuts, but you don't need a immense sketch. Several of the people I've mentioned before are very good at going into organizations and coming up with models by just talking to people and seeing what's happening. And because you write some stuff down and then you arrange it, that's how you do your modeling on that. And then you make appropriate connections between your objects. And as you understand those, you can create a few set of data structures that you'd like to have, but not a huge number, because if you have more data structures, you're going to spend more time transforming between data structures than you are going to be actually producing useful work for people in order to do that. So just keep it light and let people understand this. Mainly keep them focused on a data model's purpose. So if you have questions, or you're seeing that you're in a modeling session and people are confused for one reason or another, put down at the top of the page, the whiteboard, whatever it is you're working on in here, and say, we are in here to understand the formal relationship between soda and customer. I'm making this example up here, but we want to walk out that door with an as-is physical and logical model for this relationship. In this case, it's not terribly sophisticated. It's going to be some variant of what I'm showing you in the upper right-hand corner there. In order to do, the soda is given to the customer selects and pays for the soda. On there, we can check that against future models and see if we've added features, missing functionality, et cetera, but we've formalized these things in order to do this. Here's another one, going back to our hospital beds topic here, understanding the characteristics that differ on this. So we want to walk out the door when we can identify the top 3 characteristics that represent the brand with a logical data model. So we're trying to figure out what are the things we need to incorporate in order to do this. Primary means of tracking a patient could become important in there. That was sort of buried in the details, and we've now surfaced it as a major obstacle, and are going to try and figure something else, like plan B in this case. Our third example here again, what if we had to put the following rule change in place tomorrow? For example, we'll go back into a pandemic. Is job sharing permitted? If the rule is a employee has exactly one position, then that's going to be a problem on this, because the union is going to get on us, or whatever we're trying to figure out in there. Just add your own situation. But the key is, can I use this data modeling to confirm the fact that we have a position that we can put multiple employees in order to do this? If we're going to make this presentation to the board, and exactly one or can be filled by 0, 1, or many. Oh, well, many is very, very useful given that type of a situation here. So just finish up on this as we're headed towards the top of the hour. Goals have to be shared. There's just no other way of doing it. It's a three-way sharing. It's between the business and IT and the systems themselves. If we don't have any disagreement or refinement going on, it means we have insufficient communication. And we need to go back and look for this. If somebody is just talking about things and saying, everybody's sitting there going, yep, it's fine, it's not going to work. All of these exchanges are automated and dependent on highly successful engineering and architecture components. They've got to have a sound foundation in data modeling basics, because you need to understand the structures, the capabilities of those components as you build them forward. If you don't understand them, you're building a house of cheese and you don't have a solid foundation on it. But each of these components can be architecturally specified at this level, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We've got these things already existing. We're incorporating purpose statements in our models in this case, not trying to specifically just simply define them, but look at it from, why are we doing this? It's a problem-solving activity as well as a problem definitional activities, and that we are going to incorporate modeling characteristics by doing different modeling challenges to answer different questions. The idea that we're going to have everything modeled, of course, is useless. It's not going to happen, but we can keep as much information as we can and have that information in a way that we can easily build onto it. So the modeling use is much more important than selection of the specific methods. And we're not going to get into arguments about that, but instead maintain the models as living documents. And there will be disagreements. Let's dive in and find out what we're trying to do and figure out how and the models need to be searchable in order to do that. If we can't search them, there's just no point whatsoever. The key is to have utility. And if you have nothing else, just make sure you have a counter on your modeling components, because otherwise, how will people know what you're in fact actually producing in there? Silly things like color and clip art can really, really help your organization gain understanding of these things and derive additional value from it. But the value is a three-step process. It's not just deriving value because you've got data. You've got better organizational data, that's wonderful, but you've also got to improve the way people use that data in order to actually help people use that data in supportive strategy. So think back to our iterative design process, where things are going to get better and better and better and keep working our way around, improving each additional time we do this. This can only be accomplished by using an iterative approach, focusing on one aspect at a time and applying formalized transformations. Because if we don't have this process of doing this, we are really focusing on the model for the model's sake. And the model is there to communicate, to give us the results of an analysis or some other question that we're asking that should be shared across the top of the puzzle. I want to take just 2 minutes at the end here and give you a little bit of more information. If you're interested to dive further into these topics, there's some wonderful resources that I and other people have made uses of. First one is the data management body of knowledge, DMBOK, in there. That is the idea that data modeling chapters in there, I've done some good justice around that, contain these concepts as practice areas in here. That's just part of the overall, what does it mean to do data management? If this is your first time seeing this, please do check it out. Just Google us, you'll find us online. In order to do this, I've got a couple of other works that I'm just including in here as a general definition for you. So if you really want to get into it, but also my colleagues, David Hay, who wanted to make sure get in there. Also, I mentioned a book. This one is by Graham Simpson, really more important on understanding data modeling at a next level down around this. And as I mentioned before, some current modeling topics from Bernard Hallheim, as well as Gordon Everest around these topics here. So we're getting back into the top of the hour here. Again, extra points off if you go to my website and buy some books around that process. But let's talk about what's coming up. We've got a couple of things that we're looking forward to. So Shannon, back over to you. And what do we have coming up is metadata, and then getting quality right, and then enterprise data world coming up. So we're actually getting back together physically in person. So hopefully we will see everybody there at that point in time, and look forward to catching up in person. It's just been great having the DGIQs. I think everybody's really enjoyed getting back together. We're certainly looking forward to it too. So give you guys a second to get some Q&A together and say hey to Shannon.
Peter, thank you so much for another great presentation, as always. And just if you have a question for Peter, feel free to submit it in the Q&A portion of your screen, as I'll be reading it from there. And yes, I'm so excited, Peter, that EDW, Enterprise Data World, is back in person finally. Not digital this time. It's in Anaheim. So, you know, we're talking a lot about going to Disneyland as well, and in addition to going to EDW. And you'll be there, right? So we
Absolutely. And there's just so many ways that this is more powerful in person than it is over the Zoom session. So don't get us wrong, guys. We love you on Zoom, but seeing in person is really what gets the communication going.
Oh, I love the networking and meeting everyone in person. Yeah, it's great. Well, let's dive in here, Peter. There's some great questions coming in, of course, because we have an amazing community. So if an org has decided to build a business glossary for the enterprise, then should that business glossary be 100% aligned with a conceptual model? For example, HR business glossary must match the HR conceptual data model. Is this a DM box standard?
I don't believe there's anything in the DM BOK about that as a standard. That said, it does make sense that, actually, let's say the converse, it doesn't make sense that the two of these things are not linked up. So whether you need to alias them or otherwise somehow make people understand, your business glossary should be the nouns that people are using in the organization. If somebody calls it a flibbit, then that's what everybody needs to call it. You need to have some place in your glossary that says flibbits are the same as row 7 in this particular database, or whatever it is that they've got in there. That's the kind of consensus that needs to occur, because otherwise we find many times organizations have carefully planned what they want to measure and still ended up measuring the wrong things. And that can be a disaster in terms of reporting and other characteristics. Great question, though. Thank you for that.
Agreed. And I forgot to mention and answer the most commonly asked question, Peter, and people are asking it now, is that, yes, I will send a follow-up email by end of day Thursday with links to the slides, the recording, and anything else requested. Somebody requested the transcript, and I got to look at Zoom to see how good their transcript is, and how much it's going to take us to like scrub it. I know that the Zoom AI transcript doesn't ever get dataversity right. It's always diversity. So, you know, we'll see.
And their AI never hallucinates, right, Shannon?
Well, I will work to see what I can get for everybody, because I know you all love that. So it's been some great chat going on. So continuing on here, a conceptual data model have relationships from level 1 data concept entity to level 3 data concept in the same model. Are horizontal relationships from different level entities to different level entities allowed, or relationships must exist at the same level?
Very detailed question. Thank you for that. I'm popping back up the Zachman framework because I apply the same rules, if you will. So when you say things like allowed, it really depends on the doctrinal pieces. And whatever you do, don't let business people or managers hear you having any of these discussions about it. But the best way to think of it is that each of these architectural, I'll just go ahead and drop down to the next one here. There's those three, and we go close up on them. Each of those three can have specific relationships to the bottom or lower levels. And there's an architect, the conceptual can be related to the logical, and the conceptual can also be related to the physical, but I say can. And what you want to do is record the instances where it does occur and where it makes sense, but don't try and get them all in there for the sake of completing them. Remember, each data model is designed to answer a specific business question. Find out what that question is, use your model to answer it, and then go back to doing what you were doing before you got the question on it. Make sure that you keep the answer somewhere where it's accessible so that others won't have to answer the same question twice in there. Again, great question. I hope that makes sense. The conceptual components can show up just as they can show up in the Zachman framework, but they do not have to show up. There is no rule or body that's going to come out and smack you about if you don't do it the way they want you to do it. It really makes sense in your organizations, but I would suggest putting in there that they can show up, because that means they don't have to show up, and you certainly don't have a task that says each of these has to have many of these connected to each of those. I hope that was helpful, but a great question. Thanks.
Really good question. And, Peter, with, Chat GPT and everything else going on, the big question, coming down the pike, will AI eventually replace data modelers?
The answer is no. And the reason for that is because we've got a long way to go before everybody, including the AIs, understand the questions that are at. So I'm going to jump back to the sort of conclusion state that I had here. Let me just pop this back up. The idea is that we've taught people that modeling is something they should do. That's good, but we need to go a little better than just modeling is something that we should do. We should do modeling for the purpose of answering a question, coming up with some sort of a documentation, a design document, something that we can use in one form or another in the organization, something of value. And so the idea is, let's find a way to add value. The reason we're locked in this room is because we've never had one of these. Again, forgive my slowness here. I don't have these pre-done because I didn't know what questions y'all were going to ask me. There we go. It's yeah, okay. One of these. We need one of these for our organization, right? We need a really nice definition. It would just help if we had even that much, that everybody in about 8 departments that all use this data would be really, really useful in order to do. All right, so we want to come up with one of those. We're just going to lock ourselves in this room until we come up with, and hopefully we've got a good facilitator around that you've got is able to actually find the meaning for these things and come away with it. So these are done for a purpose in order to do that. And you find out what that purpose is and you answer the question, and then you store the model in a format so that you can reuse the information of the model and not start from zero the next time that you do this. Again, great question. Thanks for asking that.
Indeed. So, Peter, when reverse engineering is a one-person task, or when reverse engineering, is this a one-person task or a team? If reverse engineering is a team effort, who would be the players involved?
I'm sort of surprised. I literally wrote the book on this, and so if you have any trouble finding it out there, send me a note and I'll send you a PDF version of this. It has the players, it has the things. All right, so let's talk about reverse engineering, and I think that's really what probably the questioner is asking on this. I popped this slide up 3 different times during the presentation here. We teach our students the wrong context for building out these systems. They are not, for the most part, when they get out there in the real world, going to be building new things. They're going to be working on existing things. You want to know why Threads sucks so bad. Now, I'm not saying Thread sucks, but it's just not a very good system right now. And the reason is because they are reusing components that were never designed to be used in the way that they're using it. They may get it right. They may be able to engineer over top of it, but it is very definitely the pea in the pod situation there, the pea on the princess's bed in order to do this. Almost always you're going to start out by doing some form of reverse or re-engineering. And again, I just love to tell the story that my my title when I was at the Defense Department was U.S. DoD Reverse Engineering Program Manager. I was in charge of all reverse engineering for the entire Department of Defense, and I had teams doing reverse engineering projects around the globe, working on these various systems. And it was a fascinating exercise. We had measures and metrics and all sorts of things done in order to get ready for Y2K, believe it or not. There was other good rationale as well, but it was easily justifiable under the Y2K piece. Now, the question was, can a reverse engineering be a single activity? It may be as simple as a single activity. You can back your database right up to this if you know where to go read the Oracle catalog or other types of things and park it to a reverse engineering tool. It'll pull it, suck it, and spit out the physical as-is model. That's your best solution. If you have access to that, some of the systems are smart and will report themselves out in order to do this. But that is exactly what you're looking to do, is to find out the various components of your system that are there. Then you can start to see how they're organized to support faster, better, or cheaper. Right? Remember, not all three of them at once in order to do this. Now, the other part of the question was, are we going to be replaced by AI? The answer is absolutely not. We still have semantics to deal with, and AI has not done well with semantics up to this point. Semantics is the idea that I give a phrase such as "take the building." If I give that phrase to different parts of the Defense Department, they will do different things with it. If I say "take the building" to the Army, they're going to form a perimeter around it and make sure there's nobody bad inside it. If I give it to the Navy, they turn out the lights and lock up and leave. And if I give it to the Air Force, they sign a 3-year lease with an option to buy. So all of those are interpretable in different ways, and we're going to have very sophisticated AIs before they're able to handle that kind of understanding. So as for data modelers, data analysts, data scientists, I'd say your jobs are pretty safe from AI for a while. In fact, you might actually look and see what are some of the active hallucinations that ChatGPT is inserting into some of the information that it gives. Some of the information it gives is very, very good, and some of it's completely made up. And that doesn't work out so well. There's a judge in the western part of the country, I think, that's got a case in front of him right now where they submitted some briefings with ChatGPT submissions in there. Not a pretty sight, Shannon, not a pretty sight.
Oh yeah, they lost.
I figured they would.
Yeah, the judge said you cannot use ChatGPT to write legalese. But
hallucinations are a problem, folks.
Yeah, we'll see how that progresses. But so, Peter, this question came in super early, and you did cover some of this, absolutely. So, but I'm going to ask it just in case there's anything you want to add in context. So, again, this came in right at the beginning of the webinar. Will we also discuss enterprise conceptual information modeling as in an enterprise reference model for understanding the business? And you did talk about some of that, but anything you want to expand on in relation to that question and how it's phrased?
Sure, it is a good question. Again, I hope the whole point of this exercise was to give you an idea that it's more trouble to manage data and information separately than it is to manage them together as one asset in there. And so from that perspective, really, if an organization says we're going to model our data this way and our information another way, I would suggest that it's probably not going to be a fruitful exercise, because there is very little difference between them here. It's the addition of an attribute called request to an item already called data that contains facts and meanings about it. And trying to manage the two of those things separately is absolutely crazy. Now, I think the questioner, though, is asking more along the lines, let me see if I can find that slide, where we talked a little bit more about conceptual modeling on this. We've done some work over the years that has been very much fun. In others, how does one actually make use of these models? And I found two areas that are really useful. First one is sort of as a target that somebody says, hey, this is what the industry does. And I'm showing you this because this is actually nothing. It's a very abstract concept, but people do make these. And many times you can purchase them. I had one group that had purchased one of these and decided they didn't like it and wanted to get changes to it. It's like, well, no, it's not the way these things work. These are maintained by a separate group, and they claim to have at least best practices encapsulated throughout the industry. So it reminds me, Shannon, one time I was out at DGIQ. It was a sunny one, so it must have been a June one. And somebody on one of these calls asked me and said specifically, hey, do you know where I could find a data model for a pharmacy? In this case, a pharmacy cash model. And Len Silverstein literally was walking by the room at that point in time. I grabbed him and he told me what page of his books had that particular data model already set up in it. And it was just a real fun, spontaneous session. I don't know if you remember that or not. But the idea is, again, each of these things can be at the enterprise level. And you can say, there are some things that we can say about the enterprise, and we probably should say them. They may involve, for example, specification of lists on the top row here of the Zachman framework, or other types of specifications. But you're never going to specify the entire thing perfect for the entire enterprise in all likelihood, unless you are limited by size around that. And so the best thing that you can hope for from a conceptual level is to, in fact, try to get some things that we'll use. We'll use these vocabulary items and this picture to represent, these concepts for us, for the entire organization. And that makes sense. But where these things go off the rails is that organizations then say, great, we just have to specify everything. And it's like, nope. It probably follows an 80-20 distribution curve. 80% of the value can be gained by modeling 20% of those pieces. Try to keep it focused on that and don't get distracted. And you'll more than likely end up with a place where people recognize these things are useful. Let me make one more point, Shannon, before I toss it back over to you. And that is that many executives don't understand the purpose of these models and things. And I'm keeping it up on the Zachman framework for a very specific reason. And that is that I had a CIO that I worked with in New York City for a number of years, who was a very, very fine individual. And he said, I do not understand what it is you guys in the data world do, but I understand that it is important, and I understand the why of why we do it. So when I go around and I see the models that are produced here in this office by reverse engineering our legacy systems, and they're using it to plan enhancements going forward, that they are useful, that it is a valuable thing that you do. And that out of my organization of 400 people, 4 of them devoted to this seems like an appropriate amount. Let me know if you need more or less in terms of what's working here. So they also understand, or can understand, they don't get the nuances of the details that we've talked about over the past hour. They can understand the value, the guidance that people get from these things, because they are representing the golden version of just the truth about what's actually happening out there. And that the sooner you're able to get good at this process of going from conceptual to logical, and perhaps even traversing between the re-engineering components of all of this. Sorry, I went to the wrong slide there. The more value that you'll get in your organizations all the way up and down. So let me just pop that back slide up and make sure I reiterate that point as I get ready to toss it back over to you, Shannon. There we go. That's the one I wanted. And the key there is, of course, again, first reverse engineer what works well and what doesn't work. And if it's working well, we want to keep it. And if it's not working well, we probably don't want to keep it in there. So we can take it to that. Anyway, Shannon, back to you. What's our next question?
And the questioner, expanded on that same question. It is more about conceptual models using other conceptual models, because the business doesn't change conceptually, and we have only one enterprise. We don't build applications, but have 1,500 running.
Great example in terms of that. Yeah, the key is, again, where does it make sense for this thing to be true? And that's words of wisdom from Amos Tversky in there. And if you look at it from that perspective, you'll find it's very, very useful. But if you try to put it out as more of a governance kind of thing that's sort of prescriptive, it's probably not going to be useful. But thank you for the clarification.
So Peter, how does data modeling fit into reporting and analysis from a microservices domain-driven design architecture?
Yeah, so here's the thing. No matter what flavor of architecture that you're practicing, you're still going to be taking some form of an IPO model. An IPO model is an input process output model. And in that context, you're going to be reading something. Something's going to be coming into your system. That's the inputs. Your system is going to do something with those inputs. Well, the things that you're reading and the things that you're going to do with those inputs are very much at the attribute level. And if you have confusion over what that attribute is, you will be producing the correct solution to the wrong problem in there. And that happens enough that it is a term of art, if you will. So the key is to make sure that in all cases you have, relatively speaking, a good, probably even an excellent understanding of what your data requirements are. Because if you do not have that understanding of them, that means they might change. And again, the last thing you want in your build is somebody to say, oh, by the way, one of those fundamental pieces that we were talking about underneath, all of this stuff is changing on us around this. So again, I'm just going to rebuild this real quick, make sure everybody follows on this. Our as is versus our to be, what we'd like to have versus what we're going to have. Our as is should have a one-to-one correspondence with things in our existing data set in there. As such, the models will either be valid or invalid. Again, not validated is the word that is used on there in the default setting for all of them, and it should be written on all of your models that are in fact invalid in order to do that. And finally, we can break them up into logical, physical, and conceptual around there. I don't know why I always start with the middle one, logical, physical, conceptual. Again, our conceptual model is generally at a high level what is going to be happening. But as several of you have pointed out, it also can include, however, everywhere that's possible, you should implement it using this data structure. And by that, again, remember, as few data structures as we possibly can have, the better off we are. Again, that should then be transformed into a plan. So the notebook on the left represents the what, the model in the center is the how, and the physical is the resultant from that. And of course, every modeling transformation can be mapped into this. And that's, to me, much more important than arguing about whether what you're doing is conceptual or logical, what the rules are. Instead, find out what is the business problem you're attempting to solve and use the type of modeling that is appropriate there. Conceptual modeling, if it's implemented as I've described here, of wherever it's appropriate to use, then by all means can be useful, but it certainly won't be authoritative in there. So again, keep those kinds of distinctions in your mind away around that. I think that'll help guide you in terms of that.
Indeed, and we've got lots of great questions coming in. We've got about 9 minutes left, so we'll get in as many as we can here. So Peter, seeing many openings for data modelers, but requiring expert level in SQL to apply, how much SQL skill is really required for a data modeler?
Wouldn't you rather have a simple tool that is known by everybody in the world? I say that with full understanding that not everybody in the world does understand it, but certainly understood by a large people in terms of a data manipulation language. So more SQL, generally better around that. I don't urge you to skimp on that. Understanding how you divide up large sets of things easily from data structure origins is a entirely good complement to learning what you're learning here. And if you don't, eventually what will happen is you're talking to somebody and you're trying to explain to them and go, oh, you mean this in SQL? And you'll be like, yeah. And they say, why didn't you just say that in the first place? So yeah, keep a focus on SQL. SQL good, thumbs up.
I like it. So about when to start with conceptual models? Isn't a new company startup actually the best place to start before technical debt is accumulated from poor architecture?
Excuse me, I sneezed on that, but yes, that is exactly the conditions under which conceptual modeling makes sense. But make it make sense such that, and I'm going to make this very specific to your startup, such that the founders continue to care about it and understand it. So there's the challenge back to you. Yes, absolutely. If you're in a situation where you have zero in front of you and there's no reference or standard model that you can go out and rent or purchase on the market to give you some guidance, and you've looked all through Len Silverstone's wonderful books and David Hayes' data model pattern books and all the rest and can't find any place, then absolutely starting off with a conceptual model makes sense, and hopefully you'll get some good use out of it in terms of that. But at the same time, if what you're trying to do is write the world's next payroll system, I'm not sure you're really going to need a conceptual model. So fair answer, I hope. Thanks, Jenna.
Fair answer, indeed. So would the conceptual model be the reference for the business capabilities model, providing the terms to use?
Well, it's an actual one way of getting it to work that way. I had once had it was in fact that same CIO that I was telling you all about earlier, who said to me, show me what I'm going to need to have prepared, what's going to make the modelers happy. And of course, we'd all love to have perfect information, but it doesn't work out that way in the world. So yeah, I think the kind of thing that you just described is saying, all right, so we've got these pieces of it. What can we do? And what can we make sense? What is going to happen with them? Where are we going to be able to apply each of these concepts? And that is a analyst looking through their toolbox, trying to figure out what is the right tool to use to apply to the business problem. And of all things is much more valuable than somebody who says, I'm going to try as hard as I can to make this fit into what I understand as logical data modeling around this. Again, I hope that's a good answer for you, but it's very definitely a value judgment thing that you're going to get into.
I love it. So, okay, so we've got time. We've got 5 more minutes here, Peter. So should a conceptual model have too many relationships between people, places, and things, or is there a limit to the number of relationships?
Well, actually, what I just referenced in the previous question is a good limiting concept that's in there. If you can make it interesting enough that the founders will still pay attention to it, then it's worth it. And if they're not, if they can't see why they'd want to pay attention to it all, then probably not. The key to it, if you're looking at conceptual modeling, is to make sure that you incorporate strategy, security, privacy, these concepts in early in your design, because they are almost impossible to accurately retrofit. And so the key to conceptual modeling is to say, what are the big things, the things in context that this model is going to have to do? I was brought to my attention by a close friend of mine today that one of the local newspapers has a sign up that says on their website, we're just not going to mess with GDPR. So we just blocked our website from all their GDPR sites. Sorry if that offends you or bugs you, but it's quite frankly, it's not worth us to invest in that kind of nonsense. Interesting concept around all of that. And I can guarantee you that their systems were not designed in order to do that. In fact, they're designed to promote exchange of angry information back and forth. But that's a different topic entirely. Thanks, Shannon. Great question.
Indeed. So, how can you, one more question here, how can you add to a data model the time traveling function that is to have a permanent log information about the change of a data value, who did it, when did it, where did it, etc. Each instance should have its own control fields or should be a separate instance linked to the instance or entity.
Well, of course, that's a question of granularity, is it not? And there are well done examples out there time and time again. You do not need to do this and invent your own on this. And in fact, it's such a well-studied area. There's research that you can look up and find out what has been helpful in other contexts. How did it work out if we were clearing the data lakehouse instead of a special cube that was done there? And it was fresher data in the lakehouse, but it was faster access on the cube. And what was the value of that freshman, which is end up fairly nice, neat little project that you can jump onto. But yeah, it really, if you've got the luxury to do that and the ability to do that, I'd love to find out more about what you're doing to help you fine tune that, because most organizations don't get to that good of an understanding to even be able to apply the problem for it in there. But anyway, great questions today. Thank you guys so much. It's always a pleasure talking to y'all.
Peter, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for all the great questions, but I'm afraid we are coming to the end of the presentation today. Again, we hope to see you at Enterprise Data World in Anaheim in September. You can meet Peter and myself in person. Love to meet everybody in person. Shout out to those of you who are registered already. Super early bird ends next Friday, a week from this Friday. So, and again, just a reminder, I will send a follow-up email by end of day Thursday for this webinar with links to the slides and links to the recording for everybody. So thanks, Peter. I hope y'all have a great day. Thanks, y'all.
And I thank everybody as well. And thank you, Shannon. Have a great day.